that's what I came out with. So I look to Americans to help me, and I go to that election, and I think, Jesus Christ. By the way, one last thing. I'd like to throw this out. Just for you who are anti-war, I can see why you might have an anti-Vietnam War, because it didn't look like much. But whoever thinks that this is an anti-war period now is out of it. We are at war, period. There's nothing we can do about it. I mean, it's not a war you can see. We've got to prepare ourselves, so anybody who says, hey, let's do this, let's do that, let's be nice to them, I don't believe that at all. So my point is, get with people who want to survive, who are positive, who have a sense of humor. By the way, the next story Bud Day told me was that he was coming into a landing in England. He was at 200 feet, and his engine froze up, and he had to bail out. I said, oh, and he said, yeah, and the chute didn't open. Well, now, come on, Bud. Well, it's true. He landed in the trees, and what, you break your ankle or something?
That's all I broke.
So I found out that everything Bud Day told me was true. And that helps too.
Last question I'm going to ask, and then we're going to open the floor to questions, as I'm sure many of you have some. I'm going to direct to General Mechenbier. I'm hoping he won't get too political, but I'm wondering how you personally, and perhaps you can speak for the group, how you feel about the controversy surrounding the treatment of our detainees at Guantanamo Bay. For that matter, how do you feel about the comparisons between the war in Iraq and the Vietnam War?
Tony, I thought we had this discussion last night. Tony, I had dinner last night with Taylor and Bud and Doris and Taylor's boyfriend, and we kind of decided, this really is something that a military officer doesn't really have the privilege of having an opinion to express. Not that we're apolitical when you put the uniform on, but, I don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican or Libertarian or whatever, who's our commander-in-chief. We salute, we march forward, we execute the policy of those lawfully appointed over us. Now, having said that, as I look at this question, I think that the only thing that can really properly be said was said by Captain Fellows in a little different way. The men and women who are out there fighting the war now, whether it's at Guantanamo Bay, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, in a ship off the shore, or any one of those stands that we never even knew existed until a few years ago, or flying over the nation's capital, deserve nothing but our greatest respect and support. And having been part of the Guantanamo detainee movement, I was assigned, I had the privilege of being the oldest guy in the Air Force, still flying airplanes at age 62 when I retired a couple years ago. The unit to which I was assigned for flying as an attached pilot moved all the guys from Iraq to Guantanamo Bay. I can tell you right now, for every person who was in the back of that airplane with handcuffs and hoods on their head, there were 2 Americans whose mission it was to make sure if anything went wrong, they got off the airplane. They, the detainee. So the legal status of the fellows down in Guantanamo are not mine as a military officer to question, but I can tell you honestly, they're being very well treated. And it's like all the things you see in the press about how bad things are going in Iraq. In 90% of Iraq, outside 25 miles of Baghdad, it's safer than downtown D.C. after 10 o'clock at night. All I have to do is talk to the young men and women, some of these Marines who are in town who have been there. That's what I do. And as far as comparisons between the war in Iraq and the war in Vietnam, again, the military is an instrument of foreign policy, political will of this nation. And so if I have any opinion, it would be to encourage all Americans to lay aside your political opinions of the war and support the men and women who voluntarily join. We have a problem in the United States Army with too many people in country re-upping. because they're so proud of what they're doing there and what they're accomplishing there. Okay, Dr. Marshall, your turn.
Tony, do you want to add?
Just a little bit on that. As Ed said, probably the most demoralizing thing when you're in the middle of a war is the lack of support from back home. If you look at the situation with Guantanamo, when you've got someone in a captive situation, the sliding scale goes from just absolutely great accommodation to abuse, to torture, to execution. What you hear in the paper mostly is railing against someone putting underwear on someone's head or some other area that I would determine as abuse. Very little about folks that are beheading civilians who aren't even in there. And if you address the issue of what the status is of some of these detainees, my personal opinion, again, they're detainees, they're innocent until proven guilty, but I hold absolutely no comfort for terrorists, once they're determined to be terrorists, who are not sponsored by any recognized state, who are out killing civilians.
Enough said. Captain Fellows wanted to add one comment.
When I got back, my kids had grown somehow. I don't know how they do this. But they were 2, 4, 6, and 8 when I left, and they were 9, 11, 13, and 15 when I came home. And I had a little runt of a son who wore one of those Eddie Bauer baseball caps that have the bill way, so I could never see his eyes. So we sat in the room, and the first thing my daughter did was to bring out a record of the new music, which terrorized me. Everybody sat around the room talking, and Tom didn't say anything. The young guy never said a word. And I said to Pat, "What's the matter with him? He seems awfully quiet." And she said, "Well, you're not home very long. Give him some time." So they all walked out first, and he sort of fiddled around. Then he came out and lifted up his head and said, "Dad, you're the greatest." I was home.
When Jack's kid said, "You are the greatest," he was right.
I think one thing you ought to find interesting is I have 2 kids in the Air Force now, one in Airman First Class.
That's right, I forgot to mention that.
Who's going to go in the springtime. I got a daughter who goes to Talil, a tech sergeant in the Air Force in January. Jack's got kids and relatives who have been.
Yes.
Buzz got kids and Buzz going. And Tony Marshall down there has got a daughter who's 26, who couldn't be more proud of an adopted daughter. It's what the next generation did after our experience. It says, boy, we must have done something right.
Well said.
Could I focus on another kind of an issue? We're at a point where there's an enormous parallel right now with the government having essentially turned over to 1968 when Lyndon Johnson stopped the bombing, and all of a sudden our policy just got reversed in many respects. After I got released from POW camp, I, along with John McCain and the longest held prisoner Floyd Thompson, and a Marine whose name I unfortunately can't remember, got sent over to Vietnam to kind of sort out what was going on from our perspective.